Merritt Holbrook sat motionless with her hands folded in her lap as the judge read out the sentence. Her dark blonde hair was in a tight bun, and her gray suit looked too roomy. She'd lost a lot of weight in the 2 months she'd been in the detention center. To find her guilty of exceeding the limits of necessary self-defense, causing the death of a person, the words echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off the wood paneling. Merritt felt the eyes of the jury on her, the 12 men who had decided her fate. They hadn't believed her genuine fear that night when she'd awakened to the sound of breaking glass. Her mother sat in the audience, the only person close to her who had come to support her. Her father had died 5 years ago, and her few friends had dissolved as soon as the newspapers first reported the murder. That night she actually slept. She woke to the sound of a broken window in the kitchen. She grabbed the phone, dialed 911. While she was waiting for the dispatcher to answer, she heard heavy footsteps. I rushed to the door, which opened, and a man in a black mask stood on the threshold. Something glittered in his hand. 3 years imprisonment in a general regime penal colony. The prosecutor insisted on 5 years. He argued that the stabbing had come in the back when the criminal was already trying to escape. The defense talked about the lone woman's fear, that in the darkness, she couldn't assess the real threat. Merritt remembered only fragments of that night, how she'd grabbed the knife off the kitchen counter, how she had screamed, how the blade had gone into something soft. Then there were the police sirens, the red and blue flashes on the living room walls, the handcuffs. The defendant has the right to appeal the sentence within 10 days. Her attorney, James Reeves, placed a palm on her shoulder. The worst had been avoided. No one believed the prosecutor's version of premeditated murder. Forensics showed that the deceased, one Frank Donovan, had previous convictions for robbery and robbery. Standing in front of the judge, Merritt thought about how one moment could change her whole life. Until 3 months ago, she had been planning vacations to the coast, preparing her quarterly report for the board of directors, going to the gym in the mornings. Now she was facing prison walls and a new reality for which she was completely unprepared. As the escort led her down the court corridor, her mother managed to shout, "I'll be there! Hang in there, honey!" Merritt didn't turn around. She was afraid to cry. The prisoner transport car was cold and smelled of disinfection. The handcuffs dug into her wrists with every twist and turn. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine this was just a bad dream. But reality burst in with the squeak of brakes, the jingling of keys, and other people's voices behind the metal partition. There were 3 years ahead that had to be survived somehow. The last thing she saw through the window of the car was the courthouse, flooded with spring sunshine and a group of journalists with cameras. Tomorrow, the newspapers would carry another story about Merritt Holbrook's case, and the day after that, everyone would forget about her, except for her. The Lewis and Clark County Women's Jail met Merritt with gray walls and the smell of bleach. After 3 hours in the holding cell, her whole body was stiff. There was an unnatural silence in the waiting room, broken only by the jingling of keys and the shuffling of uniform boots on the concrete floor. The admission procedure began with photographing and fingerprinting. An elderly warden with a red face mechanically dictated commands: full face, profile, another profile. The flashes made Merritt squint. The next item was the physical examination. A young nurse in a laundered smock monotonously asked questions about chronic illnesses, checked her blood pressure, looked down her throat. Her indifferent tone made Merritt uncomfortable, as if she had become an inanimate object. "Out! The next procedure is inspection," came a man's voice from the corridor. Merritt flinched. A tall security guard of about 35 stood in the doorway. His name tag read, "Reed Thornton." For the first time all day, she met a gaze in which something human flashed. "I'll do the search." Another warden entered the room. Thornton nodded and stepped back, but Merritt had time to notice him frown as he glanced at her personnel file. The humiliating search procedure was followed by the issuance of uniforms. 2 pairs of gray slacks, 3 gray shirts, underwear, a jacket, all dimensionless, smelling of cheap powder. "New girl?" came a hoarse voice as Merritt, overdressed and shorn of her hair, was led down a long hallway. A woman stood against the wall, wiping the floor. Red hair, freckled face, tenacious gaze. "Welcome to hell, doll!" The guard shouted at the redhead. The woman grinned and went back to work. Merritt felt a chill run down her spine. The cell was a small room with 2 narrow bunks and a metal toilet in the corner. On the bottom bunk lay a woman reading a shabby detective book. "Dakota, take in your roommate," the guard said and slammed the door shut. Dakota Pierce slowly put the book aside and sat up. She was in her early 40s, but the deep wrinkles and the hard crease near her mouth made her look older. She gave Merritt an appraising look. "What are you in for?" "Exceeding self-defense," Merritt replied quietly, taking a seat on the top bunk. "Ha, a first-timer then. Killed who?" Merritt remained silent, looking at the gray walls. One showed scratched dates and initials. "Silent? It's okay, everyone here is getting talkative. There's time." Dakota took up the book again. "The rules are simple. You don't touch my stuff, you stay out of my business, you clean on a schedule. If you break them, you'll be sorry." By evening, the cell was filled with sounds, snoring from the neighboring cells, footsteps of the guards, distant female cries. Merritt lay sleepless, remembering her mother's last words in court. 3 years, 1,095 days within these walls. The next morning, she learned the routine. Rise at 6, roll call, breakfast at 7, work, lunch, work again, dinner, bedtime at 10. Dakota worked in the laundry room. Merritt was assigned to the library because of her college education. In the canteen, Merritt realized that the prison had its own laws. An unspoken hierarchy determined who sat where, who talked to whom. Dakota, as it turned out, carried a certain weight. Even the guards were intimidated by her. "Hey, finance girl!" The red-headed cleaning lady in the hallway called out to her. "I'm Ruby. Come on, tell me how you ended up in our coop." "Get away from her, Ruby," Dakota, who was passing by, intervened. "She's under my protection." Merritt looked at her cellmate in surprise. The latter winked faintly. "I should keep an eye on my roommate." The library was quiet and dusty. Old books on metal shelves, a handwritten file cabinet, a creaky chair. Merritt felt a little calmer here. The books reminded her of her former life. Reed Thornton often passed by the library on his rounds. Sometimes he lingered at the door, watching Merritt arrange books or help other inmates with their literature selections. There was something about her posture, her smooth movements, that made her stand out from the rest. By the end of the first week, Merritt began to realize that surviving here was an art. You have to know who to talk to, who to stay away from, who you owe what to. Dakota, for all her rigidity, proved to be a useful ally. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, Dakota suddenly asked, "Do you know why I took you under my wing? You remind me of my little sister. She was so unspoiled before she OD'd." In that moment, Merritt realized that behind the mask of the matronly criminal was a person with her own history, pain, and loss, just like behind all those walls. Reed Thornton never thought he'd end up here, in a women's prison, among concrete walls and metal bars. 12 years on the Portland police force, a detective's rank, a successful career, all of it crumbled one day when his partner was killed while apprehending a drug dealer. Reed hesitated only a second at the time, but it was enough. He left the force on his own without waiting for a command investigation. He moved to another state, took a job as a prison guard. It paid less, but no one here knew his story. And most importantly, he didn't have to make decisions on which other people's lives depended. In 3 years, he got used to the monotony of prison life. Detours, inspections, reports, all on a schedule. The shift started at 6 in the morning with a changeover and briefing. Then round the block, check the cells, escort the prisoners to work. He noticed Merritt Holbrook the first day she arrived. She held herself differently than most of the newcomers, no tantrums or tears, but a deep, underlying desperation in her gaze. When her file was brought in, Reed, against the rules, read it cover to cover. Self-defense, nighttime intruder, stabbing, all of which he'd seen hundreds of times as a detective. But there was something wrong about this woman being here. There were details missing from her case. He could sense it in his gut. The library was at the end of his usual route. A small room with tall windows draped with bars. Sunlight fell on the racks of worn books, creating the illusion of coziness in the midst of the prison grayness. Merritt had been working there for 3 months. Reed could see her changing, becoming calmer, more confident. She had started a file cabinet, sorted books by genre, even organized a small reading club for the inmates. "Miss Holbrook, how's the work going?" He tried not to stop by more than once a day so as not to arouse suspicion. "Not bad, Mr. Thornton. They brought in some new books yesterday, though mostly detectives and love stories." She always spoke quietly but clearly, never complained, never asked for favors. Only sometimes, when she thought no one could see her, she stood at the window, staring off into the distance. One day he caught her reading a newspaper from 3 months ago. Trying not to lose touch with reality, she smiled weakly. "You know, sometimes it feels like the outside world just disappeared." "It hasn't gone anywhere." Reed sat down on the edge of the table. "You just can't see it very well from here." That afternoon was the first time they'd really talked. About books, about the weather, about how the city outside the prison walls was changing. She talked about her past work, analyzing markets, forecasts, numbers. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when she talked about what she loved. "What about you? Why did you go to work in prison?" Her question caught him off guard. "Long story." He looked away. "Maybe some other time." After that conversation, something changed. He began to notice the way she furtively watched him as he walked past the library, how her voice changes when she turns to him, how she flinches if their hands accidentally touch while passing books. Dakota Pierce has noticed something too. Reed has seen her watching them with her cold eyes. A dangerous woman. She had 3 escapes from different prisons behind her, and those were just the ones they could prove. "Mr. Thornton," Dakota called out to him one day, "keeping an eye on my neighbor?" "It's my job to keep an eye on everyone." He tried to sound indifferent. Sure, she grinned. "Just don't get carried away. The walls here have eyes and ears." He realized she was right, realized he was crossing a dangerous line, but he couldn't stop thinking about Merritt the way she struggled every day to remain herself in this place, where it was easy to lose herself. One day he brought her the latest issue of the financial magazine. The prison library didn't subscribe to it. Not supposed to, of course, but he knew how important it was to her. "Thank you." She clutched the magazine to her chest. "You have no idea what this means to me." "I do." He was quiet. "You know, I lost everything I had once, too. Thought life was over. And then I realized I just had to find a new foothold." "And did you find it?" "Not right away, but now—" He didn't finish, noticing movement in the corridor. That evening, the warden summoned him to her office. Astrid Dayton had been in charge of the institution for 10 years and was famous for not overlooking anything. "Thornton, you're often in the library." She looked at him carefully over her glasses. "Checking the order, ma'am. Holbrook is doing a good job." "I'm sure she is." Dayton tapped her pen on the desk. "Just don't forget, she's a prisoner and you're a guard. Keep your distance." He nodded, feeling bitterness rise to his throat. The warden was right. He'd let himself get carried away. Forgot where he was. Forgot how this could end. But the next day, he came to the library again. Merritt was sitting at a desk, sorting through forms. A ray of sunlight fell on her face, and for a second Reed thought he saw her somewhere in another life, not here, not in her gray prison robe. "Mr. Thornton?" She looked up. "Is something wrong?" "No," he shook his head. "Just checking to make sure everything's okay." She nodded and went back to work, and he stood looking at her bowed head and realized he couldn't just walk by anymore, that in some unfathomable way, this woman had become his own lifeline in the sea of loneliness and guilt in which he'd been drowning for the last few years. And that was what frightened him the most. Merritt had never thought that the most welcome sounds in her life would be footsteps in the prison corridor. She'd learned to recognize them unmistakably slightly heavier than the other guards, with the distinctive squeak of uniform boots on the corner by the library. Reed came in during her shift at the library between 8 in the morning and noon, when most of the prisoners were working in the laundry or kitchen. The library was empty at that time. It was rare that any of the women were allowed to visit during working hours. That afternoon, she was shelving books on the far shelves when she heard familiar footsteps. Her heart habitually thumped out of rhythm. New arrival? His voice sounded hoarse. Yeah, a whole box. Mostly classics. She didn't turn around, continuing to arrange the tomes. Dickens, Bronte, even Dostoevsky is in there. Crime and Punishment? He stepped closer. Merritt felt the warmth of his body behind her back. The Brothers Karamazov. Her fingers trembled as she tried to squeeze another book onto the shelf. His hand lay on top of her arm, helping to slide the volume in. A second, another, and they both froze, unable to break the touch. Merritt! He turned her toward him, called her by name for the first time. The kiss came out desperate, greedy, as if they'd both been drowning for a long time and had finally gotten a breath of air. Books tumbled from the shelf, but they didn't hear the crash. Things had changed since that day. They learned to steal minutes, in the empty library, in the back room during shift change. 5 minutes, 10, every moment could cost them everything, but they couldn't stop. Reed timed his rounds to coincide with the hours when the library was empty. Merritt specifically asked permission to stay through lunch, ostensibly to finish cataloging. They hardly spoke during these brief meetings. Every second was too precious. Dakota noticed the change in her neighbor almost immediately. Merritt was different. It was as if a light had come on inside her that even the prison walls couldn't extinguish. She tried to hide it, but it wasn't working. Thornton's a good man, Dakota once said before lights out. His wife died 5 years ago, cancer, been alone ever since. Merritt remained silent, pretending to read. Just keep in mind, everyone here sees everything, and not everyone knows how to keep their mouths shut. Dakota set the comb aside. Be careful. Another time, she ran into Reed in the hallway. Do you know how many years you get for having an affair with a prisoner? She asked, as if, by the way. It's none of your business, Pierce. He tried to sound calm. Not my business yet, she grinned. But you realize, secrets like that don't stay secrets for long. They tried to be more careful. Reed came into the library less often, trying not to hold his gaze. Merritt had learned to look past him when they met in the corridors, but sometimes the control failed. It all happened one day when she actually stayed to catalog the new arrivals during lunch. The library was quiet, with only the rain rustling outside the window. Reed came in all wet. He'd just checked the outer perimeter. You're shivering. Merritt touched his cheek. Cold. He intercepted her hand, kissed her palm. And miss you. That day, for the first time, they couldn't stop. The hard couch in the back room, the smell of old books, the pounding of rain on the eaves, all merged into one dizzying sensation of closeness and fear. If we get caught, Merritt began, hurriedly adjusting her uniform. They won't get caught. He kissed her hair, her face, her neck. I'll figure something out. Maybe I'll transfer to another prison. And then what? Then I'll wait. 3 years isn't an eternity. She cried, for the first time in her entire incarceration. He wiped her tears and whispered some silly, tender words. They didn't notice the shadow outside the door. Dakota had come in to exchange a book during lunch. She stood for a moment, looking through the crack, then silently left. That evening in her cell, she lay on her bunk for a long time, thinking about something. A strange smile appeared and disappeared on her face. Dakota Pierce was in no hurry. 15 years in prison had taught her that there was no hurry, especially when you have such a trump card in your hand. She started from afar. Every night before lights out, she casually dropped phrases about how hard it must be to work as a guard. What a responsibility it is, how much one could lose by making one mistake. Merritt paled, but kept silent. Dakota came to the library more often. Not during secret meetings, she didn't want to spook her prey. She simply leafed through the books, watching Merritt's face change when Thornton appeared in the doorway. The way her fingers trembled as he walked past. How they avoided looking at each other and couldn't help but look. You know what the funniest thing about love is? She asked Merritt one day. The way it makes people blind, especially to the obvious things. That night, Merritt tossed and turned in her bunk for a long time, and Dakota smiled in the dark. The plan was beginning to take shape. She waited a month. During that time, she scrutinized Thornton's schedule, his rounds, his habits. She'd noticed the times he checked the outer perimeter always after lunch, in all weathers. Noticed that he prefers to go alone, avoiding partners. Got his past through my channels. History with his partner leaving the force, moving away. Got the dead wife, the house on the edge of town, the lonely nights in front of the TV. It could all come in handy. She approached Reed while he was on laundry duty. He was just checking the list of working inmates. "Pretty girl you got there, Thornton?" she said softly, pretending to sort laundry. Sophisticated, not like the local whores. He didn't answer, only the jaundices popping on his cheekbones. "I wonder what Boss Dayton will say when she finds out. Or should I write to the Department of Corrections right away?" "What do you want, Pierce?" "A talk. In private. Tonight in the laundry room, after dinner. I can't stay after my shift." "You can," she smiled. "For Merritt's sake, you can." He arrived when the last prisoners had already dispersed to their cells. Dakota was waiting for him in the far corner, where the rumble of washing machines drowned out any conversation. "I have pictures," she began without preamble, "and recordings of your conversations. You think it's hard to sneak a cell phone into prison?" It was a bluff. She didn't have any photos. But Reed didn't know that. "How much?" he asked deafeningly. "Money? No, honey, I don't need your measly savings. I need an escape. In 2 weeks, when they're taking me to the county courthouse for a retrial. I don't guard transportation, but you have access to transportation schedules, to the route diagrams, to the names of the escorts, and you can arrange a little paperwork overlay to make sure I get taken exactly when I need to be taken and exactly the route I need to be taken." Reed was silent, looking down at the floor. "Think hard," Dakota patted his shoulder. "You've got a week. In the meantime, maybe you'd like to watch Merritt read a book before bed? It's a very touching sight, especially on camera." She saw his fingers turn white, gripping his belt, the twitching of his caddy, how petrified his face was. "Don't do anything stupid," she warned him. "One word from me and the tape will go to the brass. And if anything happens to me, it goes automatically. I've got it all figured out, honey." For the entire next week, she watched them both. The way Reed vacillated between duty and fear. How Merritt sensed the change in him but was afraid to ask. How they tried to pretend everything was normal and couldn't. One day she overhears them talking in the library. Accidentally or not, the door was ajar. "Is something wrong?" Merritt asked. "You're kind of different lately." "I'm fine. It's just a lot of work." "Reed, I can see that." "Don't. Please, just don't." Dakota grinned. Love makes people not only blind, but stupid. They're willing to risk everything and lose everything. She knew that from experience. By the end of the week, Reed had given up. He came in on his own, bringing route maps and a convoy schedule. His hands shook as he handed over the papers. "Just don't touch her," he said deafeningly. "She's not guilty of anything." "Sure, fine." Dakota patted his cheek. "The main thing is, don't try to trick me. I can smell a lie a mile away, honey. And your girl is so fragile. It'd be a shame if they moved her to a maximum security unit. There's a lot of unpleasant personalities in there, you know." She saw him fighting the urge to hit her, but he couldn't. There was too much at stake. The escape was 10 days away. Dakota had already worked out all the details, where to get weapons, how to get rid of the handcuffs, where to run afterward. She had connections on the outside, she had money stashed away, she had documents. All that was left was to wait. Every night she watched Merritt, who still didn't suspect a thing. She read her books, wrote in her notebook, and sometimes cried quietly into her pillow. So naive, so in love. "You know what the most important thing about running away?" Dakota asked once, looking at her. "Getting the timing right, and leaving no trace behind you. None, especially not a living one." Merritt didn't get the hint. Or maybe she just didn't want to. The day began as usual. Dakota Pierce started her shift in the laundry room at 8 in the morning. The industrial dryers, huge, with loads of up to 50 pounds of laundry, were making an ear-splitting noise. Reed Thornton was on duty that day on the second shift. He showed up after lunch, calm and collected, carrying his usual clipboard. His gaze lingered on Dakota for a second as she walked by with a basket of laundry. "All set?" she asked in a low voice. "Yes, tomorrow at 10:30. The van will be waiting at the east gate." "Good girl. I always knew you were smart." At 5:30, the laundry room was nearly empty. The inmates were finishing their shifts, preparing for the evening inspection. Dakota stayed behind. She needed to finish drying the last load of laundry. "I'll check the dryers," Reed said, peering into the room. "Standard procedure." Sure, Dakota grinned. "By the way, I was thinking, maybe I should take your girl with me. She wants to be free too." He didn't answer. He walked over to the dryer, checking something in the fasteners. Then he straightened up. "Looks like the drum's wobbly. Will you take a look?" Dakota leaned over to the machine. At that moment, the heavy metal door slammed into the back of her head. The blow was precise. Reed remembered his police training lessons well. He pushed the body into the drum. Luckily, it was big enough. Turned the machine up to maximum speed. 15 minutes later, when he left, the laundry room was quiet. Only the dryers hummed, doing their usual cycle. The body was found at 8 p.m. when the night shift came in to check the equipment. The laundry was covered in blood. Warden Astrid Dayton personally called the police. Detective Griff Mackenzie arrived 40 minutes later. He was a tall black man with graying hair and a keen eye. He surveyed the scene, talked to the staff, glanced at the surveillance cameras on the ceiling. "Strange death," he told the supervisor. "Either a very unlucky fall or... Do you think murder?" "I don't know yet, but I need the personnel files of everyone who was in the laundry room this afternoon, and camera footage from the last week." Reed was filling out an incident report when Mackenzie entered the security room. "Officer Thornton? I'm Detective Mackenzie. I have a few questions." "Of course. You were the last person to see Dakota Pierce alive. What time was that?" "About 5:30. I was checking the equipment. It's a routine procedure at the end of a shift." "And you didn't notice anything unusual?" "No, only one drum was a bit wobbly. I wrote it down in the log." Mackenzie nodded, marking something in his notebook. Then suddenly asked, "You used to be a police officer?" "Yes, in Portland." "Why did you leave?" "Personal reasons." The detective was silent for a moment, scrutinizing him, then stood up. "Thanks for your help, officer. I may have more questions." In her cell, Merritt sat on the bunk with her arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't know the details of what had happened, but she felt something had changed. Something irreparable had happened that night in the laundry room. Mackenzie was already reviewing cell records, studying duty schedules, interviewing inmates. He wasn't jumping to conclusions, but something told him this was going to be a tough case. In the dead woman's pocket, they found a crumpled piece of paper with someone's phone number on it, and in her nightstand, an old cell phone tucked safely inside the spine of a Bible. Griffin Mackenzie liked complicated cases. In 20 years of work, he'd learned to see the hidden behind the obvious, the patterns behind the random. This case wasn't complicated. The first thing that alerted him was the cameras in the laundry room. There were 4 of them, but the huge drying machines created vast blind spots. The footage showed Dakota Pierce going behind one of the machines to retrieve laundry. Thornton follows. To check the equipment, 15 minutes pass, and only then does he reappear Odin. "Weird," Mackenzie says to the technician. "He's an ex-cop. Should have known about the cameras. Maybe that's why he picked this place. Or wanted to make it look like an accident." They found the body in the dryer drum. That same evening, Mackenzie questioned all the inmates who worked in the laundry room. Most had left half an hour before the accident, the end of their shift. One older woman recalled Dakota bragging about how she would soon be free. "Did she say that a lot?" the detective asked. "No, just the last couple weeks. Also, she was always hanging around the library, even though she didn't like to read." Dakota Pierce's cell phone turned out to be a key. There were no pictures, no records, just a list of calls from the last month, all to the same number. Mackenzie punched it in, a payphone at a gas station 50 miles from the prison. "She was plotting an escape," he told the warden, "and someone was helping her." Astrid Dayton went pale. "But how? We have a strict regime, inspections. People will always find a way. The question is, who had access to the prisoner transport information?" Mackenzie started digging deeper. Dakota's personnel file revealed interesting details, 3 escapes from different prisons. Each time she was aided by guards, each time she used compromising material. He interviewed all the guards that day. Reed Thornton kept his cool, answered clearly. Too clear, like a man who knows he's being watched. But there was something else in his eyes, a mixture of fatigue and relief. The camera footage showed the usual picture. Prisoners working, guards making their rounds. But one detail caught the detective's eye, the library. Thornton went in there too often, and the librarian was Merritt Holbrook. "Tell me about Miss Holbrook," he asked the supervisor. "Quiet executive. In jail for excessive self-defense. Been working at the library for 6 months." "And Thornton?" "One of the best employees, after the story in Portland." "What story?" "His partner was killed in an arrest. Thornton left on his own, though he wasn't blamed." In Dakota's personal effects, they found prisoner transportation routes. Thornton's handwriting on them was obvious. He'd given them to her under blackmail pressure. The detective began to understand the pattern. Dakota noticed something between the guard and the prisoner, decided to exploit it, but miscalculated, underestimated what a cornered man is capable of when threatened by someone he loves. Merritt held firm until the detective put the surveillance photos in front of her. The rare shots of her and Reed looking at each other a little longer than they should, where their hands casually touch as they pass books, where he lingers in the library doorway, watching her work. Dakota knew, Merritt said quietly. She threatened to tell. "And that's why Thornton killed her?" "What? No, he couldn't!" But fear flashed in her eyes. She knew he could. For her sake, he could. It was a mosaic: blackmail, escape plans, murder. Mackenzie came to arrest Thornton that evening. He didn't resist, just asked for 5 minutes to pack his things. In a desk drawer, the detective later found a photograph of Merritt. Must have cut it out of a personnel file. "She would never leave us alone," he said in the cell. "Even after we escaped, would have kept us on the hook. I couldn't take that chance." "Love makes people blind," the detective observed. "No, love makes people desperate." The story went public. The newspapers savored the details. The affair in prison, the blackmail, the murder. Journalists were on duty outside the courthouse trying to get sensationalized footage. The trial was quick. The evidence, the confession, the motive, it all worked against Reed. 10 years maximum security. As he was being led away, he turned for a second, not to the reporters, but to the far corner of the room, where a hunched figure in a dark dress sat. Merritt's mother had come to the trial, the only one who could understand what it was like to kill in defense of love. Merritt didn't come to the announcement of the verdict. She sat in the library, poring over the books the two of them had once discussed. Waiting for her in her cell was her new roommate, a young girl who had gone to jail for theft. "You know what the worst thing about love is?" she asked the new neighbor one day. "What it can do to a person. Turn him into someone he's not." A year after Reed's trial, Mackenzie was back in prison, a new case. Walking past the library, he saw Merritt. She was still working there, arranging books. Only there was gray in her hair. "Is he writing to you?" the detective asked. "No, we thought it was for the best." But a week later, a letter arrived at the library. No return address, just 4 words inside. "I would have done the same." Merritt burned the letter in the bathroom. From then on, they never spoke again, both realizing that some stories were better off not continuing. But sometimes, looking at the bars of the windows, she thought about how the real prison wasn't those walls. It's the memory of what might have been if things had turned out differently. Griff Mackenzie often remembered the case. It reminded him that the worst crimes are committed not out of hate or greed, but out of love, blind, desperate, willing to do anything. The detective still has the case file in his office. Sometimes he takes it out, rereads the testimony, looks at the photos, and thinks about the fact that in a world where love can turn a good man into a killer, his job is not just to catch criminals, but to try to understand where that thin line between truth and lies, between duty and feeling, between salvation and death. And every time, closing the folder, he remembers the words of Thornton, "Love makes people desperate." Maybe, the detective thinks, that's the ultimate truth, that sometimes we do the worst things not because we're bad. It's because we love too much.